the Sentinel of Sycamore Street. The old house on Sycamore Street was a living, breathing entity to 10-year-old Kemi. It wasn't just the Victorian gingerbread trim that framed the windows like lace, or the way the floorboards in the hallway sang a specific, creaky song. It was the memory dust that settled in every corner. In the sun-drenched living room, she could still see the ghost of her father, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a laugh that rumbled like distant thunder, teaching her the wobble at a family reunion. Her small feet balanced on his shiny dress shoes. In the kitchen, the scent of her mother's jollof rice, a fragrant, tomatoey masterpiece, seemed to have seeped into the very walls, a permanent, comforting presence. But that was before the long, silent drive to the cemetery, before the stark, brutal truth of a head-on collision that stole the thunder and the fragrance, leaving only a crushing, hollow quiet. Now the house was just a large, empty shell for Kemi and her grandmother, Jima. Jima was a fortress of a woman, her back slightly bent from decades of nursing, her hands gentle but firm, her love for Kemi a fierce, unwavering flame. But even a fortress can feel vulnerable in the dark. Jima's pension was stretched thin, and the big house, with its aging plumbing and greedy heating bills, was a financial anvil. They were managing, but just barely. The vibrant, colorful life they'd once known had faded to a palette of muted, cautious tones. Kemi's sole, vibrant constant was Bear. He was a rescue, a chaotic mix of Rottweiler and only God knew what else. A hulking, 80-pound mass of jet-black fur and lolling pink tongue. Her father had brought him home as a wriggling, clumsy puppy 2 years ago. "A guard dog for my girls," he'd said, winking. Bear, however, had failed his guard dog duties spectacularly. He was terrified of vacuum cleaners, would surrender his toys to the neighbor's belligerent cat, and his most intimidating sound was a joyful, groaning woof when his belly was scratched. But to Kemi, he was perfect. He was her confidant, the silent recipient of her tears into his thick fur, her warm, breathing weighted blanket on lonely nights. He slept curled at the foot of her bed, a living, snoring fortress of his own. When the silence of the house became too loud, she would press her ear against his side and listen to the steady, strong thump-thump-thump of his heart, a rhythm that assured her the world hadn't completely stopped spinning. Tonight, the house felt particularly large and the silence particularly deep. A cold front had rolled in, and the wind whistled a mournful tune through the sycamore trees that gave the street its name. Jima had been called for a double shift at the hospital. "It's just for one night, baby," she'd said, her voice thick with fatigue and worry as she kissed Kemi's forehead. "Mrs. Henderson next door knows you're here. You have my cell. Keep all the doors locked. Bear will look after you." Kemi had nodded, putting on a brave face. "We'll be fine, Jima. Bear won't let any monsters in." She'd meant the imaginary kind, the ones that lived in shadows and closets. The real monsters she believed only existed in the news. After Jima left, the house settled into its nocturnal rhythm. Kemi did her homework at the kitchen table, Bear lying heavily across her feet, a living foot warmer. She made herself a peanut butter sandwich for dinner, sharing the crusts with her devoted companion. As darkness fell completely, she moved through the house, performing the ritual Jima had taught her. Deadbolt on the front door, chain lock slid into place. Back door, check. Lock the basement door. Check all the windows. Finally, she retreated to her bedroom, the one sanctuary that still felt fully hers. She was reading a book about a girl who could talk to dragons when the first sound came. It wasn't the wind. It was a sharp, metallic scrape from the back of the house. Bear's head, which had been resting on his paws, lifted instantly. A low, guttural sound vibrated from his chest, a sound Kemi had never heard before. It wasn't a playful woof or a curious whine. It was a warning. "Shoo, Bear, it's just the wind," she whispered, her own heart beginning to patter a little faster. He ignored her, his body tense, his ears pricked forward. He was staring intently at her closed bedroom door, towards the kitchen. The house was silent again for a long moment, and Kemi began to relax, chiding herself for being silly. Then, The distinct sound of splintering would echoed through the house. The back door, fear, cold and sharp, injected itself into Kemi's veins. Her breath hitched. This wasn't a monster from a storybook. This was real. Bear was on his feet in a fluid, powerful motion. The low growl deepened, becoming a continuous, menacing rumble. He positioned himself squarely between the bed and the door, his hackles raised, making him look even larger, more primal. Voices, muffled, male voices from the kitchen. Told you the old lady was a nurse. They gotta have cash or good stuff. Just grab and go, man. Quick and quiet. Check that. Looks like a TV in there. Kemi's blood ran cold. She was frozen, her fingers clutching the comforter so tightly her knuckles were white. Her mind screamed for Jima, for her dad, for anyone. But there was no one, just her and Bear. The footsteps were heavy, moving from the kitchen into the living room. Drawers were yanked open, their contents dumped onto the floor. The sound of breaking glass, probably the crystal vase that had been her mother's, made her flinch. Bear's growl was a promise of violence now. He took a step forward, his nails clicking on the hardwood floor. Kemi? A rough voice called out, too familiar with her name. It sent a fresh wave of terror through her. How did they know her name? Mrs. Henderson must have mentioned it. The betrayal was a secondary, icy shock. Little girl, we know you're in here. We're not gonna hurt you. We just want the money your grandma hides. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying they would take what they wanted and leave. But the footsteps were coming closer, down the hallway now. They were checking the rooms. The doorknob to her room jiggled. Locked, a second voice grunted. So? It's a flimsy piece of crap. A shoulder or a boot slammed against the door. The wood around the lock splintered with a sickening crack. That was the trigger. As the door burst open, revealing 3 hulking figures silhouetted in the dim hallway light, Bear erupted. He didn't bark. He launched himself from a standstill into a full-bodied charge, a black bolt of pure, protective fury. The sound that ripped from his throat was primordial, a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The lead intruder, a man in a dark hoodie, had no time to react. Bear's full weight slammed into his chest, knocking him backward into his companions with a startled yell. The scene devolved into chaos, shouts of surprise and pain, the snarls of a dog who was no longer a pet but a weapon. Get it off! Get it off me! The man on the floor screamed. Bear had his forearm in his mouth, shaking his head violently. Kemi screamed, scrambling back against her headboard, pulling her knees to her chest. She was trapped. The fight was blocking her only exit. The second intruder, a taller man, recovered from the shock first. He swore viciously and swung the heavy flashlight he was carrying, connected with Bear's ribs with a dull, sickening thud. Bear yelped in pain but didn't release his grip, his focus absolute. The third man, skinnier and more frantic, was waving a knife. I'll cut him. I'll cut the damn dog. Forget the dog. Grab the girl. The one on the floor grunted, trying to pry his arm from Bear's jaws. The tall man with the flashlight ignored him, his anger now focused on the animal that had ruined their easy score. He brought the flashlight down again, this time on Bear's head. Kemi watched in horror as her dog staggered, his growl faltering for a second. A dark trickle of blood matted the fur above his eye. But he held on, a tenacious, furry anchor holding the monsters at bay. The moment of distraction was all the tall man needed. He kicked out, a brutal, booted foot connecting hard with Bear's side. Bear was thrown against the doorframe with a pained whimper, finally releasing the first intruder's arm. Bear! Kemi shrieked. The dog tried to get up, his legs scrambling, but he was dazed, hurt. The tall man stood over him, flashlight raised for a final, devastating blow. No! The word was torn from Kemi's throat, but it was the man with the knife who moved next. His eyes, wide and wild, darted from the struggling dog to the terrified little girl in the bed. The plan had gone to hell. There was a witness, a dog that had torn up his friend. Rage and panic overrode their original intent. "This is your fault, you little brat," he snarled, taking a step towards the bed, the knife glinting in the low light. In that moment, time seemed to slow down for Kemi. She saw the hatred in his eyes. She saw the blood on her dog's fur. She saw the broken door, the violation of her safe space. And something inside her, some deep, primal instinct inherited from generations of survivors, snapped. She wasn't just a scared little girl anymore. She was a cornered animal. As the man lunged, Kemi didn't freeze. She moved. She rolled off the opposite side of the bed, hitting the floor with a thud just as the knife blade sank into the mattress where she had been. From the floor, Bear saw it all. His girl was in imminent mortal danger. The pain from his ribs, his head, his side. It all vanished, burned away by a white-hot nova of purpose. With a final, monumental effort that drew on every last ounce of strength in his loyal heart, he pushed himself up. He didn't go for the arm. He didn't go for the leg. He launched himself through the air, a black shadow of sacrifice, and clamped his powerful jaws onto the wrist of the hand that held the knife. The man screamed, a high-pitched sound of agony and shock. The knife clattered to the floor. He flailed, trying to shake the dog off, but Bear held on, his body a dead weight, his jaw locked. "Shoot him! Somebody shoot him!" the knife man shrieked. The first intruder, clutching his bleeding arm, fumbled in his jacket and pulled out a small, ugly pistol. Everything that happened next was a blur of sound and motion. A deafening bang shattered the air. Bear's body jerked. He made a small, choked sound, and his grip on the man's wrist went slack. He collapsed onto the floor, a dark, still pile. The gunshot seemed to break the spell for the intruders. The reality of what they had done. A home invasion, a child, a shot fired, crashed down on them. "Let's go. Now!" The tall one yelled, his bravado gone, replaced by raw panic. They didn't look back. They stumbled over each other, fleeing down the hallway, through the ravaged living room, and out the broken back door into the night, leaving behind the shattered silence. Kemi couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled her nostrils. Her eyes were fixed on Bear, lying so still on her lavender rug, which was now darkening with a spreading crimson stain. "Bear," she whispered, her voice a tiny, broken thing. There was no joyful woof, no thumping tail, no sound at all. A wail built in her chest, a sound of such profound, soul-crushing loss that it felt like it would tear her in two. She scrambled on her hands and knees around the bed, ignoring the dropped knife, and threw herself down beside him. "Bear? No, 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 Bear. Please," she sobbed, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch him and hurt him more. His side was still. She pressed her ear to his fur, desperate for that steady, comforting heartbeat. There was nothing, only silence. He was gone, her protector, her best friend, the last living piece of her old life. He had given everything for her. The sacrifice was absolute. The grief was a physical weight, pressing her into the floor. She buried her face in his still warm fur and wept, her small body shaking with the force of her sobs. The world had ended. Again. It was the blaring of a car horn from outside that eventually pierced her despair. Then another, and the distant wail of sirens, growing louder. A neighbor had heard the gunshot and called the police. Minutes later, the house was flooded with swirling red and blue lights. Officers moved through the broken door, their voices calm and professional, their guns drawn until they cleared the rooms. They found Kemi in a catatonic state of shock, curled into her dog's side, covered in his blood. A female officer with kind eyes gently pried her away. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now. You're safe." Kemi didn't feel safe. She felt hollowed out. She was bundled in a blanket and led out of the room, her eyes never leaving Bear's body until the doorframe blocked her view. The aftermath was a chaotic blur. The police station. Jima, her face a mask of terror and relief, crushing Kemi in a tearful embrace. Questions. So many questions. Descriptions of the men. Kemi answered in a monotone, her mind still back in the bedroom, on the rug. The intruders were caught before dawn. They weren't criminal masterminds. The one with the bitten arm had gone to the emergency room, and his story had fallen apart under the slightest pressure. The gun, tossed in a storm drain a block away, was found. They would go away for a long, long time. It was a small, cold comfort. They returned to a clean, but deeply wounded house. The back door was repaired. The broken glass was swept up. A cleaning service had scrubbed the rug in Kemi's room, but a faint, shadowy stain remained, a ghost on the floorboards. The silence in the house was different now. It wasn't just the silence of absence. It was the silence of a profound loss. Bear's food and water bowls, sitting empty in the kitchen, were a daily gut punch. The lack of his clicking nails on the floor, the absence of his happy greeting at the door, the house felt deader than ever. Kemi retreated into herself. She stopped reading her fantasy books. She didn't draw. She moved through the days like a ghost, her eyes distant, her smile extinct. She had nightmares, waking up screaming, reaching for a furry body that was no longer there. Jima was beside herself with worry, arranging for therapists, trying everything to pull her granddaughter back from the abyss. A week after the incident, a package arrived. It was from the police department. Inside, carefully folded, was a small blue blanket. One of the officers had taken it upon himself to have it cleaned. It was the blanket from Kemi's bed, the one Bear had slept on every night. It no longer smelled of gunpowder or blood. It just smelled clean. That night, Kemi pulled the blanket over her. In the dark, she thought she could catch a faint, fleeting whisper of his scent. That familiar, musky, doggy smell that was uniquely Bear. It was the first night she didn't have a nightmare. The next day, she went into the backyard for the first time since it happened. The late autumn sun was weak but bright. She walked to the old oak tree in the corner, where Bear used to love to lie in the shade. There, nestled in the roots, was one of his chewed-up, slobber-covered tennis balls. She picked it up, the familiar texture a painful comfort. She sat down under the tree, the ball in her hand, and finally let herself remember him not as he was at the end, but as he was for all those years before. The clumsy puppy, the goofy dog who would run in his sleep, the loyal friend who would rest his head on her lap when she cried, the living, breathing, joyful creature who had filled the silence. He hadn't just been a pet who died. He had been a hero who had chosen to die. For her, his sacrifice wasn't just about stopping the bad men. It was the ultimate declaration of a love so pure it demanded everything. A single, hot tear traced a path down her cheek, then another. She didn't try to stop them. This wasn't the hysterical, shattered weeping of the night he died. This was a deep, cleansing grief. She cried for him. She cried for the life he should have had, full of more tennis balls and belly rubs. She cried out the poison of the terror, letting it flow out of her with her tears. When the tears finally subsided, she felt lighter. The crushing weight was still there, but it had shifted. It was a weight she could carry now. She looked up at the sycamore tree, its branches bare against the gray sky. She thought of her parents. She thought of Jima's tired, loving face. She thought of Bear. They were all part of her. Their love wasn't lost. It was woven into the fabric of who she was. Her father's laughter was in her own. Her mother's strength was in Jima's hands. And Bear's courage, that was now in her heart. She stood up, the tennis ball held tightly in her hand. She walked back to the house, her steps a little firmer, her back a little straighter. Jima was at the kitchen window, watching her, a look of tender concern on her face. Kemi walked inside. The silence was still there, but she didn't feel alone in it anymore. She could feel them all with her. She went to the hall closet and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside were her art supplies, untouched for weeks. She took out a piece of paper and a charcoal pencil. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd done her homework with Bear at her feet, and she began to draw. She drew a little black girl with her arms wrapped around the neck of a big, goofy, black dog. She drew them not in a room of terror, but under the sycamore tree, in the sun, both of them safe and both of them loved. It wasn't a picture of an ending. It was a promise